Now, here's something you might not know. Did you know that FlutterFlow itself is a web app built with FlutterFlow? If you didn't know that, you're in good company. Because if you're like most developers, you're probably using FlutterFlow to develop mobile apps and nothing else. But here's the thing. FlutterFlow, built on the incredible Flutter framework, lets you write code once and have your app work seamlessly on mobile, desktop, and the web. Yes, you can build fully functional web apps with FlutterFlow, and that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today. All right, so here I am inside of FlutterFlow, and I went ahead and built a sample web app, and this is a front end to Hacker News. And if you're not familiar with Hacker News, you can go ahead and check it out at news.ycombinated.com. This is a website that has a lot of tech news and stuff like that. So I went ahead and built a web app that aims to kind of mimic it, right? Just to show you how easy it is and how practical it is to build all kinds of web apps, okay? Now, the first thing that I want to cover is that when you're starting out and you're trying to build an app in FlutterFlow, you can start anywhere, right? So you can start in a mobile view, you can start in a tablet view, you can start in kind of this desktop web app view, okay? And so any app that you build can potentially run on all kinds of platforms and on all kinds of devices. And so if I start out building this app here, I can have it as a web app, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. But I can also have it as a mobile app. I can decide later, well, I don't want just a web app. I also want a mobile app. Okay, so now I'm going to have a web app, a mobile app, and also I can run it inside of a tablet. But then maybe later I decide I want it also to be a desktop app, and I can do that as well. Okay, that's kind of the beauty of Flutter, and the beauty of FlutterFlow is that you have this freedom to write code once and have your app run across all different devices. Now, obviously, you can also limit the kind of devices that you want your app to run on. Okay, so if I want to just build a mobile app, I can have a mobile app. Okay, I don't need to build a web app. I don't need to build a desktop app. So I have complete and kind of this unrestricted freedom to build any kind of app that I want, to whether it's going to run across all kinds of different devices or it's only going to run on one specific platform. The second thing that you need to understand, and this is very, very important, is that when you are building web apps, you need to be very sure that the app that you're building is responsive, okay? And so what this means is that, whether the user is looking at it, in the big screen or in kind of a narrower screen, your app is going to adapt, okay? And so let me show you what I mean. So here I have the real Hacker News, right? The official website open here. And I'm looking at it in my browser, right? So this is a web app. I'm browsing it and I'm trying to check it out. I'm looking at different things. So if I expand it across my entire screen, as you can see, this web app doesn't really change. It's still visible. It's still, legible. I can still interact with it. But watch what happens when I make it really, really narrow, right? So maybe I want to work on a couple of apps here. I'm trying to compare different things. So I have a couple of screens open. So if I make it narrower, what you may have noticed is that a lot of these things, they start wrapping around. So this title here with the host, they wrap around. So if you take a look at this number 8, you see you have the title and you have the host. But if I expand it here, if I do this right here, you can see that the host name is on one line. It's on the same line. But if I make the screen narrower, it starts to wrap around. Same thing happens with this one here. So if you look at 25, you can see that there's actually a really long, well, relatively long title here, okay? And so it looks good kind of in this view here, and it looks good in this view, and it looks good in this view. But if I make it narrower, if you take a look at 25, it starts to wrap around. Now, you have to take that into account because that's not going to happen automatically in all scenarios. Okay, so the moment you see that something changes, right? The moment you see that something changes, you have to understand how to prevent issues. Okay, so let me show you what I mean with my app here. So here is my app, and as you can see, looking at it in a mobile view, it looks pretty good, right? If I expand it to kind of a tablet view, it still looks pretty good. And in this desktop, kind of this web view, it still looks pretty good. And by the way, this app uses the official Hacker News API to get the stories. So you're going to be seeing the exact same stories that you're going to be seeing here. Okay, so it's not just dummy data. You're going to be seeing the exact same stories there. Okay, now watch what happens if I make a small change. Basically, if I revert something that I did in my app to its default behavior. Okay, so I'm going to go back here and I'm going to click on this widget here, this text widget that displays the stories, the title of the story and the host. And I make it the default. Okay, so this is the default setting. And I go ahead and I rebuild my app. And so now we're looking at the app, but we have a problem. We have an overflow issue. Okay, now this issue appears in a narrow view. Okay, so this is our mobile view, but you're going to be seeing the same issue in a web view as well, right? So if you're running it as a web app and the user happens to kind of narrow the screen, right? Like exactly as I was doing here, you know, I'm looking at it like this and I decide I want to squeeze the view. I want to make it narrower. Well, guess what? You're going to be seeing this issue. And this is obviously something that you do not want your app to have. Obviously, this is not going to be much of an issue on wider views, right? So if I go to the tablet, it looks fine. If I go to the desktop, it's also going to look fine, but I will still have that issue in these larger views if I have a title or titles that are too long, right? So if we have, let's say, this title and it happens to have a lot of other things in it, a lot of other words, and it stretches beyond its available view, it's not going to wrap around like you see here, right? So we're still going to have this issue, okay? So even though we may not see this issue in kind of these wider views, right, in this tablet and this desktop web view, it's still a problem that needs to be dealt with, okay? And so that is why it's very, very important when you're building web apps. It's a must that you need to familiarize yourself and really master FlutterFlow's layout mechanics. Okay, and I actually have a really comprehensive video that you guys should check out. I'm going to be linking that video right there that kind of talks to you and explains to you from the ground up what you need to do, why it's happening, how to fix it. And so after you watch that video, you're going to be a new person because you're not going to be making these mistakes, okay? And so when you're building the app, you want to make sure that it's 100% responsive. Now, this will obviously depend on the type of app that you're building, okay? In this app here, I can see that, you know, if I have it here, it's fine. But if I squeeze it, if I make the layout narrower, right, the screen size narrower, it starts to wrap. And so the moment you notice that, right, the moment you notice that something is changing, you need to understand that. You need to make a note of it because it may not happen automatically. And in many situations, it does not happen automatically, right? Because you're going to be seeing that overflow issue, okay? And so in this specific case, we need to make sure that the title, as well as the host, right? We have it as part of the same widget, they wrap, okay? Now, why do we need to do that? Well, it's important to understand the way that constraints are set in FlutterFlow is that the parent controls them, okay? So, you know, this title and host, they can be as long as they want, but the parent ultimately sets constraints. Now, these here are children of this row. And row, as it happens to be, it does not set constraints. Row does not care. Row basically, it doesn't really care what the size of its children. You can be as you know, as narrow as you want, you can be as wide as you want, you can be as small as you want, you can be as long as you want. The row does not care. Other widgets care, right? It really depends on the widget, and that is why you should check out that video. But row does not care. And so, you know, if you put a really long title, row is not going to complain. But you know who will complain? Flutter is going to complain because row is not setting constraints. But that means that it's going to expand, beyond the viewable area, right? If it's too long and you have a relatively narrow view, it's going to expand beyond the viewable area. And this is a big issue. And so what you can do in this specific situation, right? So if you are working with widgets that are children of either row or a column, what you can do is you can use something called this flex expansion. Okay, so by default, it's set here. And by the way, you're not even going to be seeing these options on widgets that are not children of either rows or columns. Okay, so keep this in mind. So if I go somewhere else, like I'm looking at a card, I'm not seeing it. If I'm looking at a list view, I'm seeing it because this is a child of a column. Okay, so keep that in mind. Very, very important. So back to this widget here. Okay, by default, what really happens is that nothing happens. Okay, it's going to place it inside of a row. It's not going to give it a constraint. And so that means as long as, whatever the length of the title, whatever the length of that text widget, that is what Flutter is going to try to place it. But of course, as you saw, that's going to result in issues in certain situations, okay? And so what we need to do is we need to select one of these, okay? So what is the difference? Well, this one here is flexible, meaning that if we select it and it's not going to overflow, it's not long enough, there's no risk of an overflow, it's going to behave like a default. But if there is a risk of an overflow, it's going to wrap it around, right? It's going to set a constraint. It's going to say, look, you can't place this whole thing in a row because that's beyond the viewable area. Right, so it's going to set an automatic constraint, and this is what you want. This is exactly what you want. The other option is this one. Okay, so if you hover over, you're going to see this is called expanded. Okay, and this is what I call a greedy expansion because it's going to expand it regardless of the initial length of the text widget. Okay, so even if it's short, it's still going to take up the entire row, and we don't really want that, right? We want it to only wrap if it needs to wrap. And that is why we're picking the second option, right? This is called flexible, okay? So if we select that, if we go back here and we rebuild our environment, you're going to be seeing that now it behaves exactly how we want it to behave, because now you see it wraps around. That is because we've given it a constraint, meaning that the constraint is the length of the row, and the length of the row is in this case the width of the viewable area. Okay, so if you come over here, we're fine, right? So in this case, it's only taking up as much space as it needs. It does not take up maximum space, and this is exactly what we want, because maybe later on we want to place something here or we want to do something here. We only wanted to we only wanted to have that constraint whenever there is a risk of an overflow. And so now you're seeing, this beautiful behavior, okay? And later on, when we run the web app, you're going to be seeing this as well. And so this expansion thing here that I just talked about, this is going to depend on the type of app that you're building. In this case, because we want that wrapping, this is what we are using. But, if you're building a completely different, web app, maybe you're going to have widgets, maybe you're building a dashboard, you might be using a wrap view, or you might be using a grid view, or you might be using a combination of both. There's all kinds of different ways to make your app responsive depending on, what kind of app that you're building. And this is super important in web apps. Because with web apps, you never know what the user is doing, right? The user might, make your web app super narrow. They may, make it like this. They may do so many things, right? You have no idea. You have that control when you're building a mobile app, right? You have more of that control. But when it comes to web apps, you don't have that level of control. So it's very important that you do this, right? If you're building web apps using all kinds of modern technologies, such as, CSS, HTML, React, etc., you're going to be making your app responsive from the ground up, right? All of the apps that you are using, all web apps, they're responsive, right? Because they're using various technologies, typically with CSS, to make the elements that you see on the screen responsive. Okay, there's all kinds of libraries, frameworks, etc., that guarantee, that help to make your app responsive. So they make sure that your app it wraps its content in the needed places, right? Amongst other things, right? There's many things, but it guarantees that kind of responsiveness. And that is something that you really have to get right when you're building web apps. Unfortunately, it's not very complicated. Just watch that video, build a couple of apps, and you're going to come a long way to mastering this process, right? It's not very, very complex. The next thing that's very important to understand when it comes to web apps is links. Okay, so when you're building a mobile app, the user does not need to know the exact name of the page or of the screen view. They do not need to know the link if there is a link. They don't care about all that. That is something that we as developers need to care about, okay? Because when it comes to mobile apps, there is an understanding of deep links, okay? So even with FlutterFlow, if you open this command palette here and you search for deep, and you go to this first result, you have something called routing and deep linking. And you can kind of, click on this tutorial and kind of to learn more about it. But essentially what it means is that in mobile apps, you can have links that only developers know about so that we can always redirect the user to a specific part of the app, to a specific screen, to a specific area on demand. So we can potentially have a link that the user clicks on that not only opens that app, but also displays a specific screen, specific area. And so here you can kind of learn more about it, but you need to set up a URL scheme. You also have advanced route settings, etc., etc. Now with web apps, it's completely different, right? Because when you are using a web app, when you're browsing a web app, you see that link in your browser bar. You see exactly where you are. So as an example, if I'm, checking out Hacker News, I see where I am. I see the URL. I see the URL. So if I click on a story here and I'm looking at the comments, I see that the URL has changed, that I'm no longer on the home page. I have an understanding. I have an idea of where I am, right? I can go back to the home page, and here I'm on the home page. I can see the URL. I can confirm that this is the authentic, the official, the original Hacker News site, because I see what I'm visiting, right? There's more transparency. And so when it comes to web apps, the links are always visible. The user always, noticing them. They're always looking at them. They can interact with them. They can change the URL. And that is not the case with mobile apps. So with mobile apps, it's an optional thing. You don't really need to kind of worry about it all that much unless you have a specific case, right? When it comes to deep links. But with web apps, it's something that's an integral part of the app. It's always there. It's always in the user's face. The user is always interacting with it. And so that is something you have to keep in mind, right? So for instance, we have here a screen, and this view here, right? If you go to the top level, this homepage, you can specify route settings, right? So in this case, it says homepage, and this is going to be the link that the user can potentially use to access this app. So we have another page called detail view, okay? And this is just a blank page. And here it says route detail view. Now we can click here and we can change it. We can say detail view. I can rename it. And this is what the user is going to be seeing. This is what the user is going to be interacting with, okay? When we actually deploy the app and the user is, consuming your app. This is what they're going to see in their browser tab window, right? So if you come here, home, I can say this is just home. Okay, I can change that, and that is going to be visible to the user. And so links is another area that you kind of need to be familiar with, because it works completely different as compared to mobile apps or even desktop apps. Now, the next area that's extremely crucial that you guys need to be familiar with when you're using web apps is that not all third-party plugins support web apps, okay? So if you're building an app, chances are you may visit pub.dev or another similar site. And this is a repository for all kinds of third-party Flutter plugins. And I've made tons of videos that use all kinds of third-party plugins to do amazing things, right? And this is great because it saves you a lot of time from needing to do it yourself. So for instance, here I'm looking at a table calendar plugin, and this is an amazing plugin that allows you to display all kinds of calendar functionality, right? You can display this, you can, save events, you can do all kinds of cool things. And this is a very, very popular plugin, right? Has 100% popularity, right? So chances are, if you're building an app and it needs calendar functionality, right? You can use FlutterFlow's built-in, but it's very, very limited. If you're looking for something a little bit more feature-rich, you can use this instead, and I highly recommend it. Now, what I didn't talk about before is that if you take a look in this area right here, it says here platform, and it lists the platforms where this table calendar can be used, meaning that this table calendar supports these platforms here. Now, as the case is with table calendar, it actually supports all of the platforms, right? So it supports Android, it supports iOS, it supports Linux, it supports macOS, web, and Windows. Okay, so if you're building an app for Android, you can use it. If you're building an app for iOS, you can use it. If you're building an app for Linux, macOS, web, Windows, chances are you're not going to have any issues. Okay, and so this is not only a popular plugin, but it's also a universal plugin, right? Because you can use it across all kinds of different apps, so web apps, Windows, etc., etc. But that is simply not the case, all right? So if you take a look at this other plugin, this is called Music, okay? And it's not as popular as the other plugin, and it also doesn't support as many platforms as the previous plugin. So this specific plugin happens to support only Android and iOS. And so if you're going to build an app that would target web, right? So you're building an app, it's gonna be a mobile app, but you also decide later on that you also want to have a web app version of your app. Well, the problem that you're going to be dealing with is that you won't be able to use this plugin, okay? It's just not going to compile for a web platform, right? For a browser. It's just not going to run on a browser. And so at this point, you have several options that you need to be looking into. First is whether there's another plugin that has similar functionality to this plugin that supports your platform. So with music, chances are we'll be able to find another plugin that does it, because music is a very kind of broad area. There's lots of demand. There's lots of plugins being created. But if you're dealing with a very narrow kind of specific area where you need some very, very specific piece of functionality, chances are there may not be another plugin. It could be this just one plugin that you found by accident after searching for many, many hours. And this happened to me many, many times. And when that happens, I quickly scan and I want to make sure it supports my platform. It's very, very important. Okay. And so it may support, it may not support. Okay. So if you cannot find another plugin, your other option is to connect with this developer and see if they can adapt their plugin to support this, other platforms like the web platform. Okay. And so you can pay them, maybe you can ask them and see if it's possible. And if none of that is possible, then you can't use this plugin. Then you have to either do it yourself, or you may have to kind of change the way your app works. But thankfully, lots of plugins that I've been using, that I've showcased to you guys over the years while building all kinds of apps, they happen to support lots of platforms, right? Because I always check this. And so this is not an issue you're going to be dealing a lot. But this is an issue that you may be dealing with from time to time. So it's important to understand that, okay? And the reason that is the case is when people are building plugins, these plugins are going to be doing something specific that Flutter or FlutterFlow may not be doing out of the box by default. And so because Flutter is kind of this layer that runs on top of so-called native code, right? This is like code that people write, right? So if you're building an iOS app, you may be using Swift. If you're building an Android app, you may be using Java or Kotlin, okay? So, and Flutter kind of sits on top of that. And as a result, Flutter cannot do everything, right? FlutterFlow, Flutter cannot do everything. These plugins need to be written in kind of this native platform specific language. And that is why this plugin here, it has Android and iOS support. That is because this person went in there and he wrote these native hooks these native connections, right? So maybe this person wrote Kotlin code for Android or Swift code for iOS, but they didn't do the same for web or other platforms. Okay, and so this is something that you need to be paying attention to. And so next time you're looking at different plugins, definitely pay attention to the platform. Okay, because lots of times you're going to be seeing that they support Android and iOS, but they may not support web. Okay, or they may not support Mac OS, but they may support this, or the other way around. They may support web and Mac OS, but not Android and iOS, or maybe just Android, not iOS, or maybe just iOS and not Android. So this is something that you should be paying attention to anytime you're using third-party plugins. All right, so now that we've covered all the gotchas, all the different things that you need to kind of be aware of when you're building web apps, let's go ahead and launch and deploy our first web app. Okay, and we can actually do it right inside of FlutterFlow. And so what you want to do is you want to bring up the command palette with Command K or Control K, and you want to search for web here. Okay, so first you're going to be seeing this link here. Click on platforms. Now, by default, you're not going to have this enabled. Okay, by default, your projects are going to have this. I believe when you're starting a brand new project, you have an option to enable the web, but I believe that it is not turned on by default. Okay, so if you do not turn that on during that initial wizard, you're not going to have this turned on here. Okay. And so now I'm going to turn it on, and we can also expand this area, and you have some extra settings that you can turn on as well. Okay. So these are advanced web settings. Okay. Here we have use original engine initialization. This is experimental, or use Canvas kit, which is beta. Okay. And I recommend to not touch these settings unless you have issues, unless you're experiencing some issues. In that case, it might be a good idea to test your app with those settings, okay? So now that we have this, the next thing that you want to do is you want to type web and go to web publishing, okay? And you're going to be on this page here where you can publish your app right from FlutterFlow. Okay, so as you can see, I already tried publishing just to make sure that it works. But typically what you need to do is you need to fill out this part of the page here. You have some options here as well. And typically what you need to do is you need to give your app, your web app, a site URL. So here I just said Hacker News, and by default, it's going to publish it off of flutterflow.app domain. Okay. You also can enter your SEO title, description, page title. You also have something called custom headers. Okay. And this is really, really important and actually really, really cool. Because if you're building a web app, chances are you may want to use some kind of third-party plugin or some maybe analytics, track clicks, track visitors, track page sessions. You may also want to have, a cookie if you're doing some kind of advanced tracking. If you're building like a store, you may want to store like a Facebook cookie so that you can track who your visitors are. Another thing that this is good for is for like AdSense, right? If you're building a web app, you may want to display like AdSense banners or banners from some other ad network, and you can insert all of this code in here. Okay, so now I'm talking about things that I would never be talking about when it comes to mobile apps, because we're now in a completely different world, right? We're in a completely different world where we have SEO, where we have description, page title. We also have something called a fav icon. And this is an icon that users will see in their browser, right? So sometimes in tabs, sometimes on the page, on the page itself, that allows the users to easily identify the site in their browser tabs from all the different sites that they may be visiting at that moment, okay? And over here, we also have a bunch of other settings, individual page titles. This was turned on by default. You can turn that off, showcasing, etc., etc. So I'm not touching these. And the only field that I'm setting is here, because otherwise it uses your site's name to populate this, and you probably do not want that. You probably want to customize it. And last but not least, you also have an option for a custom domain. Now, I believe this is an option only on some of the higher plans. I do not believe that this is an option on like the free plan, etc. But I have a different plan, so I'm not sure if you're gonna have access to this area right here. Regardless, when you are done, we're gonna click on publish, and now we need to wait a couple of moments for FlutterFlow to compile your app, take all the resulting Flutter code, and upload it where it's going to be accessible here. So let's wait a couple of moments for this to finish. All right, so now our app has been published. So it says here live on here, and we can actually visit our app on the web and see, if everything is fine, if there are no issues. And so I'm going to click here, and that's going to open up our app. And now we're looking at our own Hacker News, okay? And so we can resize it. As you can see, it wraps it correctly. Everything looks good. Everything is fine. And so this is the exact mirror of the official Hacker News, right? So as you can see, this is exactly what is here. And also, as you can see, if we make it narrower, it wraps it correctly. So for instance, this thing here, number 14, it has the host here, but because we've done that flexible expansion thing, it wraps it correctly. If we didn't do that, we would be having issues, okay? Because it would just try to kind of expand fully. And so at this point, we are happy with how this app behaves because it loads up fine. It gets all the data via an API. It's responsive. It looks exactly like it should look, but we are not done yet. The last and the most important phase of developing this web app is to actually launch it, okay? And we can do it from FlutterFlow. You can attach a domain name that you may already know, or you can simply go out, buy a domain name, attach it here, and then your web app will be available at that domain name. But there's another thing that we can do. We can actually download this entire app onto our computer and host it on all kinds of providers, right? So you can host it on Amazon's S3, you can host it on DigitalOcean, you can host it anywhere. And the beautiful thing with Flutter's web apps is that you don't need to host it on a special environment, right? You don't need to host it on like, Vercel or Firebase hosting or any of that, right? You can host it like a regular web page because the web app is fully client side. Okay, so it's going to be running inside the user's browser. And so you can host it anywhere. And so you can host it, but for virtually free on something like Amazon S3, right? So if you're not getting a lot of hits, or you're getting a little bit of hits, you're not like getting massive amounts of hits, your hosting costs are going to be super, super low. So let me show you how this is done. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click here and I'm going to download all this code for this app that we've built onto my local computer. Okay. And so I'm going to click here. I'm going to open up my terminal and I'm going to paste this command. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and execute it. And that will download this entire code onto my local computer. Now, once I've downloaded the app and I have this whole project on my computer, what I need to do is I need to type Flutter build web. Okay, once I type that, that's going to go ahead and create a web version of my app. So I went ahead and did that. And so now all I need to do is go to this directory, build web, and I have my entire app right here. Okay, and what's nice about it is that I don't need any kind of special hosting environment where I need to pay by the CPU minute. So like Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure or anything like that. I can simply copy it and host it on a static hosting provider, such as like Amazon S3 or many of these other ones. And this is going to cost me practically nothing. So if you're building a web app and you're trying to test it out, you have a domain name, you can link it to your hosting provider, get all of this, copy all of this code, and simply display it. So let me show you how this is done. And so I've just connected to my Amazon's S3 bucket, right? And so what I can do is I can simply take all of this code and copy it over. I'm going to open up this directory right here. This is my app right here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to select all of this here, and copy it here and wait for this to finish. All right, so it just finished copying. So now I have my app in an Amazon S3 bucket, just like storage, just like, static documents and stuff like that. And now I can view my app on the internet, right? So all I need to do is select a file, come over here, copy this URL, and go ahead and access my site. And once we visit the URL, this is the app that we're seeing. Okay, so we can click on the links. This all works. Okay, and so this is how you can take any app that you're building and create a web app, or you can simply use FlutterFlow to build web apps from the ground up. And this is something that I do for prototypes, for quick apps, just to see if something is going to work or not. And then later on, I can decide, do I want to make a mobile app? Do I want to make a desktop app? It's very, very simple and straightforward once you understand the gotchas. Now remember, you'll be able to view and or clone this exact app as well as all my other apps that I talk about on this channel as a member of our incredible Patreon community. And so if you have any questions, you have any doubts, you're not sure about something, you want to connect with other members of our amazing community, then what you want to do is you want to click the first link in the description and join our incredible Patreon community, where you'll be able to get access to this app here, which means you can view it, you can clone it, you can do anything that you want with it. And most importantly, you can ask questions and kind of connect to other members. And I am there, our community is there, and we're always trying to help people out if they're stuck somewhere. And beyond that, you're also going to get access to extra content, such as our Q&As, our deep dives, where I talk about different apps, concepts, topics at a much greater depth, much greater length than my public YouTube videos. You're going to get access to that as well. And most importantly, when you join our Patreon community, you're going to be supporting this channel and supporting my work, and that is highly, highly appreciated. So if you're getting any value from these videos that I'm putting out, if you're learning something new, you're building your app, or maybe you're getting ready to build the app of your dreams, then you definitely need to join our amazing Patreon community, because you're going to get even more value as a member. And you can do just that via the first link in the description below the video.